The weight of every floor. I was never meant to go below level 4200. That was the boundary written into my assignment brief, stamped with the triple seal of the Administratum Subsector Bureau of Varanthos Prime, countersigned by 3 different prefects whose names I had memorized, but whose faces I had never seen. The brief was 18 pages long, dense with procedural language and jurisdictional caveats, and at its core, it asked something quite simple. Go down, count what you find, and come back with numbers that could be filed. The structural collapse on level 3847 had severed the primary data conduit network serving the lower 7,000 levels of Hive Golgothar, and the Administratum needed its census restored before the next tithe assessment cycle. I was Executor Scribe Aldrin Voss, mid-grade census administrator, rated, competent in field documentation, and adequate in hazardous environment protocols. I had submitted accurate population projections for 11 consecutive cycles. I had never once filed an incomplete report. I did not think of myself as a man prone to fear. I was prone to procedure. The Administratum Hive office on level 4180 was a room I had occupied for 9 years. It smelled of recycled air and tallow fat lubricant from the pneumatic document tubes that ran along the ceiling, and the walls were the particular shade of gray that existed nowhere else in the known galaxy except inside Imperial administrative chambers, a gray so perfectly neutral it seemed designed to prevent thought. My desk was made of pressed fiber board reinforced with iron strapping, and upon it sat my data slate series 7 through 11, my portable census engine, my 2 backup quills in case the auto stylus failed, a half-consumed ration brick of compressed grain and protein slurry that I had been eating in disciplined increments since the morning bell, and a framed parchment bearing the motto of the Administratum Bureau of Census and Enumeration: what is counted is known. What is known can be controlled. I had believed that, once. The requisition order had arrived by pneumatic tube at the 6th bell, which was early enough to be unusual. The brass capsule had come through the primary conduit rather than the secondary, which meant it originated from at minimum a level 4000 authority. I opened it carefully, as I opened everything carefully, and read its contents twice before setting it down on the corner of my desk that I reserved for items requiring immediate action. Then I read it a 3rd time. The collapse on level 3847 was described in the dry, passive voice the Administratum preferred for disasters. A structural realignment event had occurred, resulting in communication infrastructure disruption, affecting census data nodes across strata levels 1 through 3846. The Bureau required full structural documentation, population enumeration, and infrastructure status assessment for all affected levels. Standard enumeration protocol applied. Mission duration estimated at 47 days. I was to depart from the level 3900 transit hub no later than the 4th bell of the following morning. 47 days. I looked at the number again. Then I looked at the range of levels. 3,846 individual floors of Hive Golgothar, ranging from the upper Manufactorum belt down through territories that, in 9 years of census work, I had documented only as aggregate statistical projections derived from historical data and population modeling. The lower levels of any hive city were not places where executors of my grade typically traveled. That was work for arbitrators, for specialist underhive enumerators with protective equipment and armed escorts. I checked the supply requisition attached to the order. It listed 1 personal data slate with extended battery pack, 1 portable census engine, 1 standard issue rebreather mask, 1 set of mid-hive administrative robes, 1 canteen of purified water, and 7 days of ration bricks. No weapons, no escort, no hazardous environment suit. The silence of the office felt different after that. I filed my existing reports, organized my pending correspondence into priority order, and placed my inactive data slates in their charging cradles before locking my desk. I did these things deliberately, giving each action its proper weight. When I extinguished the lumen globe above my desk, the room returned to the dim orange glow of the corridor outside, which came from bioluminescent algae cultivated in the ventilation shafts, and which always reminded me of something dying at the precise pace required to remain useful. I stood in that light for a moment before gathering my assigned kit. I told myself it was just a counting job. The transit hub on level 3900 was one of the last major transit intersections before the official threshold of what the administratum called the intermediate strata. The hub itself was a cavernous space perhaps 300 meters across, with ceilings lost somewhere in a darkness that had never been properly addressed with lumen infrastructure. The floors were black iron plate, worn smooth by decades of foot traffic, and the walls were covered floor to ceiling with transit schedules, work quotas, gang ordnance postings, and administratum census notice boards displaying population figures that I recognized as accurate because I had filed several of them myself. The air tasted of promethium exhaust and hot metal and something else underneath, something biological, something the ventilation system was managing but not eliminating. There were perhaps 4,000 people in the hub when I arrived. I stood at the entry arch and watched them, workers in heavy canvas and rubber, faces wrapped against the grit, arbitrator patrols moving in threes, their carapace armor scratched and repainted so many times it had lost its original color. Hive gangers in the designated tolerance zones, marked by their gang colors, watching the arbitrators watch them. Servitors hauling freight, their biological components installed into industrial chassis with the utilitarian indifference that the Mechanicus applied to all such conversions, their faces slack, their ocular implants recording everything and processing nothing. Children running errands for manufactory overseers. Priests of the Ministorum standing at portable shrines, delivering the litany of the Emperor's labor blessing, their words swallowed by the noise of the hub. This was civilization, as the administratum recognized it, organized, catalogued, counted. I checked in at the transit administrative desk, received my authorization stamp, and made my way toward the descent shaft reserved for official personnel. It was a cage elevator, iron and cable, large enough for 20 bodies standing close, and it descended into the lower strata via a series of manually operated brake levels that required a designated shaft operator to release each time. The operator assigned to my descent was a middle-aged man with burn scars across one side of his face, and the patient, emptied expression of someone who had been responsible for lowering things into darkness for so long that the act no longer held any quality for him at all. He looked at my authorization stamp without reading it and nodded. He pulled the cage gate shut. The descent began. I will try to be precise about what followed, because precision is the only instrument I have ever truly trusted. I am a man of records. I measure things. I document. If I can hold what happened inside the language of documentation, perhaps it remains the kind of thing that happened, rather than the kind of thing that simply was. That distinction matters to me. It mattered to me then more than I understood. The upper levels of Hive Golgotha were not where my story began, but they were where I learned to read what I was descending into. I had known the upper spire only as a statistical abstraction. I had filed census returns for the noble tier, levels 7,800 through 8,417, the official peak of Golgotha's registered height. The numbers were always clean, the population densities were always rational. The tithe returns from the noble houses of the upper spire arrived on time, in the correct format, with the appropriate seals, and the figures they contained bore the same precise relationship to reality that a portrait painting bears to a human face, recognizable, composed, and systematically stripped of anything unflattering. I had never traveled the upper spire in person, but on my descent, I passed through its administrative relay stations, where sub-offices of the Bureau maintained the nominal records for the noble and governmental tiers. I stopped at the level 7440 relay station to verify my credentials with the local branch and to charge my data slate from their power supply. The relay station was nothing like my office on level 4180. It was carpeted. The walls were paneled in synthetic wood that had been treated to approximate the appearance of genuine lumber, an extravagance that in the mid-hive would have purchased 3 months of additional ventilation for a manufactorum block. The clerks wore robes of slightly better quality than mine. The lumen globes were full spectrum, the kind that mimicked natural light from a planetary surface, and which the administratum only authorized for spaces where visiting dignitaries might need to be impressed. The branch administrator who met me was named Colis, a narrow-shouldered man of approximately 60 with the kind of precise, rehearsed courtesy that was indistinguishable from hostility. He verified my credentials without offering me a seat. He had heard about the collapse on level 3847, he said. Regrettable. He assumed the Bureau had the matter well in hand. I asked him, because it was my professional responsibility to ask, whether the level 7000 through 8417 census data had been affected. He said it had not. I asked whether he had any updated population figures for the noble tier that I could cross-reference with the main census engine during my descent. He paused before answering. The pause was not long, perhaps 2 seconds. But 2 seconds is a long time for a question about census figures, which are by their nature technical rather than political, and which should produce an immediate reference to the nearest data stack, rather than a pause that contains something I could only describe as calculation. He told me the noble tier census figures were current and filed, and that he would transmit them to my data slate before my departure from his station. When they arrived, I checked them with the instinct of 9 years of professional practice. The figures were current and filed. They were also, I noted with the portion of my mind that catalogued discrepancies without immediately processing their significance, approximately 17% lower than the projections my own census models would have generated from the birth and death rate data submitted over the previous 2 decades. 17% is not a rounding error. I filed the discrepancy in the pending review folder of my data slate and continued my descent. I would return to it. I was meticulous about returning to things. That was, I think, both my professional strength and the quality that made what eventually happened to me possible at all. Level 7000 through 6500 constituted what the official registry designated as the administrative crown, the governmental and judicial apparatus of Hive Golgotha. The planetary governor maintained his primary residence on level 7200, a fact I knew from census records but had never had occasion to consider in personal terms. The residence itself, which I passed through only the external access corridors of during my transit, was a structure that occupied the entirety of its level's floor plan, a single continuous building that had been constructed, expanded, demolished in sections, and rebuilt so many times across the centuries that it bore no coherent architectural style, only the accumulated scar tissue of power, expressing itself through construction. The corridors outside it smelled of polished stone and electro-incense, and something underneath those smells that was older and less pleasant, the smell of buildings that were inhabited continuously for long enough that the stone itself began to absorb the habits of its occupants. 2 Tempestus scions stood guard at the primary access corridor junction. They wore their carapace armor with the absolute stillness of people trained to perform stillness as a weapon, and they watched me with the incurious alertness of soldiers who had been in proximity to power long enough to have calibrated their threat assessment entirely toward political rather than physical danger. I was a census administrator with an administratum authorization stamp. I was, in their assessment, not dangerous. They let me pass with a glance. It was on level 6800 that I first encountered something my census engine had no category for. The level was designated in my registry as Governmental Administrative Overflow, a formal name for what were in practice the extended bureaucratic offices of the numerous noble houses and governmental departments that could not fit their administrative apparatus within the Crown proper. It should have been, according to all historical census data, a level of moderate population density occupied by senior clerks, mid-ranking officials, and the various legal, ecclesiastical, and commercial representatives maintained by the noble houses. When I descended to it and began my standard documentation protocols, walking the main thoroughfares with my portable census engine recording ambient population density via bio-auspex, I found that large sections of it had been recently vacated. Not abandoned, vacated. There is a difference. Abandonment leaves things behind. Vacant spaces that have been deliberately cleared leave nothing. The offices I walked through had bare desks, dust patterns on floors that indicated furniture recently removed, disconnected data conduit terminals, empty document storage racks. The lumen globes were still powered. The ventilation still ran. The maintenance servitors still moved through their cleaning routes, polishing floors that led to empty rooms. Someone had methodically removed the population of an entire administrative district and left the infrastructure running, like setting a table after removing all the food, all the plates, and all the people. My census engine recorded a population for this section of level 6,800 of approximately 42 individuals, where historical records projected 4,000. I documented this. I did not yet understand it, but I documented it with the same care I would have applied to anything, because documentation does not require understanding. Documentation requires accuracy. Understanding, I had always believed, would follow. I continued down. Level 6,000 through 5,500 marked the transition to what the registry called the Upper Manufactorum Belt, though the word upper here was relative only to the vastly larger manufacturing zones beneath. These levels were dedicated to precision manufacture and specialist fabrication, the production of refined components, optical instruments, data processing equipment, and the higher grades of servitor components that required controlled environments and more skilled labor than the bulk manufacturing levels below could provide. The workers here occupied a social stratum that the administratum characterized as skilled labor grade 3, which meant they were allowed to know what they were making, which was a distinction that mattered enormously to them and was reflected in census data that showed markedly lower mortality rates and modestly higher caloric intake allocations than the bulk labor levels. The air on these levels was different from the administrative crown. It had weight, not humidity exactly, though there was humidity too, the warmth of thousands of bodies in enclosed spaces, the moisture of industrial processes. What it had was particulate, tiny fragments of metal and polymer and ceramic suspended in the recycled air, invisible but present to the back of the throat as a faint mineral dryness. I put my rebreather mask on properly for the first time. I had been wearing it loosely, the way you wear something you do not yet believe you need. The foremen I spoke with on these levels were cooperative in the way that people are cooperative when they have been specifically trained to respond to administratum authority as an extension of the quota systems that governed their professional survival. They gave me their figures. They showed me their production logs. They answered my questions with the precise brevity of people who knew that any ambiguity in communication with a census official could result in their numbers being interpreted in ways that might affect their departmental resource allocations. I took their data, I verified it against my census engine's ambient counts, and I found the figures accurate to within acceptable variance. But I noticed that whenever I asked about the levels below, a particular stillness came over whoever I was speaking to. Not the same stillness as the Tempestus Scions, which was trained and weaponized. This stillness was older. This was the stillness of something learned in childhood and never since examined, a reflex that predated analysis. The foreman would answer my questions about the levels below because they were required to answer, and they would do so in voices that stayed level and eyes that moved just slightly to the side, as if checking to ensure nothing nearby had heard the question asked. They used passive voice for everything that involved the lower regions. Things were produced down there. Material was supplied up from there. Events had occurred at unspecified times without specified causes. None of them asked when I would be coming back. I descended through level 5,000, the broad equatorial band of Golgotha's bulk manufacturing infrastructure, and the change was immediate and total. The air quality dropped, the lumen coverage dropped, the sound rose. If the upper levels had been architecture with people inside it, the Manufactorum Equatorial Belt was something that had inverted that relationship. It was people with machinery inside them, humanity installed into industrial process, the way the mechanicus installed biological components into servitor chassis, with the understanding that the person and the function were now the same thing, and that neither had rights independent of the other. I want to be careful about my language here. I am a census administrator. I count people. I do not evaluate the moral quality of the arrangements I count. The administratum does not hire people who evaluate moral quality, because moral quality is not a census category. But I am also a person who has spent 9 years looking at numbers, and numbers, when you spend enough time with them, begin to contain the shape of what they measure. The numbers in the equatorial belt told me things about the equatorial belt that no amount of official registry language could soften. Mortality rate per production shift, recorded as acceptable variance. Production quota completion rate, recorded as within standard. Average worker lifespan post-induction into equatorial belt labor, recorded as operationally sufficient. Operationally sufficient was not a duration I had seen specified in the documentation. I stopped and asked a senior shift overseer to explain how the administratum defined operationally sufficient as a lifespan metric. He looked at me the way the foreman on level 5500 had looked when I asked about lower levels. Then he said, "It means they last long enough to matter." I wrote that down, word for word. Level 4500 was the first time I smelled the underhive. Not tasted, the way I had tasted the particulate in the upper manufactorum belt. Smelled. There is a specific odor produced by human population density when it exceeds the designed capacity of ventilation infrastructure by a sufficient margin for a sufficient duration, and it is composed of components that I will not itemize, but which, when encountered at the concentration present on level 4500, constitute a physical presence. The smell had mass. It arrived before anything I could see or hear, and informed me, with absolute authority, that I had passed a threshold. Level 4500 was officially categorized as secondary labor residential, meaning it housed the workers from the levels above who could not be accommodated in the on-level dormitory blocks of the manufacturing tiers and were required to transit vertically to their workstations. In practice, what this meant was that level 4500 was one of the most densely inhabited floors in all of Hive Golgotha, a level whose population had never been capped by any practical mechanism, and whose growth had been addressed by the administratum through the expedient of simply increasing the official capacity estimate whenever the population exceeded the previous one. My census engine registered the ambient bio-auspex count on level 4500's main residential thoroughfare as approximately 11 times the density that the structural load calculations for that floor's construction had been designed to support. I stood very still for a moment and looked at the floor beneath my feet. The iron was old, not old the way the administrative corridors were old, with the kind of institutional antiquity that made old things feel solid and permanent. Old the way things are old when they have been subjected to load and stress and vibration for longer than their designers planned, which is the kind of old that expresses itself as fatigue. I could feel, very faintly, through the soles of my standard-issue administrative boots, the micro-vibrations of the level below in constant industrial operation, transmitted through structural members that I now understood were bearing more than they had been designed to bear. I added a structural integrity query to my documentation. I noted the load variance as a high-priority finding. I moved on, because moving on was what the mission required. The actual site of the collapse at level 3847 was sealed behind administratum barrier posts of orange plasteel that were relatively new, their surface not yet scratched or tagged or absorbed by the surrounding environment the way everything eventually was in the lower hive. A 6-person arbitrator team maintained the perimeter. The senior officer, a proctor named Thresh, checked my authorization with a handheld scanner before waving me through the outer barrier. She was a compact woman with close-cropped gray hair and the particular quality of alertness that people develop when they have been in proximity to genuine danger for long enough that awareness becomes automatic. The collapse itself was astonishing. Level 3847 had once been, according to my registry, a secondary Prometheum distribution hub, a level whose function was almost entirely infrastructural, filled with pipes and junction nodes and pressure regulators rather than people. The collapse had not been caused by the weight above, as the official notification had implied. It had been caused by something rupturing from below. I could see this clearly in the physical evidence. The floor of 3847 had not failed downward, sagging under load. It had been breached upward. The iron plate of the floor was bent in a distinctive pattern, folded back at the edges of a roughly irregular opening, approximately 40 meters in diameter, with the folds of the metal pointing toward the ceiling rather than toward the floor below. Something had come up through the floor of level 3847. Proctor Thresh confirmed this when I asked, in the flat, deflated tone of someone who had been waiting to either report this fact officially or pretend it was not true, and was still not certain which of those options was open to her. There had been an event. The arbitrators had designated it a structural realignment event at the direction of the local administratum liaison, because structural realignment event was the approved terminology. I recorded it as I found it. I was careful not to ask what she thought had caused it, because I had the professional instinct to understand that she was already carrying more of that question than was comfortable. Below the breach, the levels changed character entirely. I descended through level 3846 to 3500, which were the last levels that the official registry characterized with the detailed granularity of upper and mid-hive documentation. Each had a designated function: secondary residential, bulk materials storage, transit infrastructure, auxiliary manufacturing. Each was sufficiently far from the collapse event that their populations, while clearly unsettled, were functionally intact. I conducted my census work methodically, floor by floor, using the standard ambient bio-auspex count for density estimates, supplemented by direct enumeration at choke points and transit nodes. The numbers were always less than projected. Not dramatically, not in the catastrophic way of the vacated district on level 6800, but consistently, level after level, 3 to 7% below what the historical census models predicted, and the variance increased the further down I went. I noted this as a persistent finding and continued building the dataset, because a dataset requires sufficient volume before its patterns can be classified as statistically significant rather than random noise. By level 3200, the pattern was statistically significant. There was something happening to the population of the lower mid-hive that was not being captured by mortality records, labor transfer records, or residential relocation records. People were leaving the count in a way that left no administrative trace. This was either a documentation failure, a catastrophic failure of the data collection infrastructure I was descending through, or something else. I listed all three possibilities in my pending review file with equal weight. I was not yet ready to prefer one over another. By level 3000, I was ready. Level 3000 was officially designated as tertiary industrial residential, which in practice meant it was not residential in any meaningful sense, and not industrial in any organized sense, but rather an accumulated human ecology that had grown in the interstices of both categories without ever being properly assigned to either. The registry gave it a population of approximately 200,000. My census engine's ambient count gave it something closer to 400,000, a surplus that could not be explained by undercounting in the historical data or by routine drift in the projection models. The undercounting I had observed above and the overcounting I found here were not separate phenomena. People were moving down, not in response to administrative directive or labor transfer order, not through any mechanism that generated a paper record or left a trace in the transit system's automated logging. They were moving down the way water moves through a structure with a leak, constantly, quietly, following the path that offered least resistance, accumulating at the lowest accessible point. And the lowest accessible point, in this case, was not level 3000. Level 3000 was merely where I could still see the accumulation against the backdrop of documented numbers. Below this, I understood, The documentation thinned until it became theoretical, and below the theoretical, there was what actually existed. The first hint of gang territory came on level 2800, not through anything visible, but through the particular realignment of behavior in the people I encountered. In the mid-hive and upper manufactorum belt, people looked at my administratum robes with the specific complex reaction that imperial citizens develop toward administrative authority, a mixture of deference, resentment, calculation, and the performance of compliance that had been rehearsed through enough interactions with authority figures that it happened almost automatically. On level 2800, people looked at my robes differently. They looked at them the way you look at something that belongs in a different context, the way a deep water creature might respond to a surface water organism that had descended further than such things were supposed to go. I was recognizable. I was not, in any functional sense, authoritative. The administratum robes that had been sufficient to command cooperation in every level above were here simply information. Information that I was out of place. Information that I was alone. Information that the institutional weight those robes represented was, at this depth, theoretical. The gangs that controlled territory on level 2800 did not have formal names in the sense that I understood names. That is, names that appeared in arbitrator gang registry files. They had marks, geometric symbols sprayed or cut into every surface that served as territorial boundaries, and these symbols were maintained with a precision that suggested their meaning was taken very seriously by everyone in their vicinity. I was not troubled by them, initially. Gang territory was documented phenomena in every hive census below level 3500. I had protocols for navigating gang-controlled areas during enumeration. Maintain official posture. Do not make eye contact with territorial displays. Respond to direct questions with reference to administratum authority and enumeration mandate. Document and continue. The protocols assumed a population that still responded to administratum authority as a concept. On level 2800, I spoke with a woman who described herself as a district accountant for what I gathered was a significant territorial group. She was perhaps 40 years old, with a close-shaved head and both arms extensively modified with what appeared to be Mechanicus-adjacent but non-standard cybernetic enhancements, functional implants installed without the formal sanction of the Adeptus Mechanicus that the mid-hive and upper levels required. She wore the gang marks as tattoos on her neck and collarbone. She answered my census questions with the precision of someone accustomed to managing resources and numbers, but she organized her responses according to categories that were not mine. Her accounting did not include people who had gone further down, she told me. I asked her to clarify. She said, "When someone goes below 2500, they stop being part of the account." I asked why. She said, "Because they stop being people we have numbers for." I asked what they became. She looked at me for a long moment with the evaluating expression of someone deciding how much to answer, and then she said, "They become something the levels below have numbers for." Then she stood up and indicated that the interview was complete. I recorded the exchange verbatim. Level 2500 marked the official boundary between what the Administratum Registry designated as Underhive Tolerance Zone, a category that acknowledged gang presence while maintaining the pretense of nominal imperial jurisdiction, and the strata below, which carried the bureaucratic designation of Unmonitored Residential Region, a classification that meant in practical terms that no imperial authority had direct oversight and no census data below this line was based on direct enumeration. My assignment was to go below. I descended to level 2400 in a maintenance shaft rather than the transit cage system, which had ceased to operate below level 2600 due to what the last shaft log entry called infrastructure fatigue. The maintenance shaft was a vertical steel tunnel with iron rungs welded to one wall, descending through consecutive floor plates via sealed hatches. I had my data slate clipped to my chest, my census engine in my pack, and my rebreather mask properly fitted. The hatches were heavy, manual, and increasingly difficult to open the further down I went. not because they were locked, but because they had been sealed by the accumulated pressure of organic material packed around their edges, the living sediment of levels that had been growing inward for long enough that the joints between structural elements had been filled by everything that had settled there. Organic material was perhaps not the correct term. Much of it was, but some of it was not. Level 2400 was the first level that did not appear in my registry with a specific functional designation. The entry for level 2400 in the Hive Golgothar official register of strata carried only a numeric identifier and the notation, Subtolerance Residential, enumerated by projection. I had seen that notation before and understood it. It meant no census official had directly enumerated this level in living memory, and the population figure was generated by a mathematical model that extrapolated downward from documented upper-level data using historical growth rates. What I found on level 2400 had never been modeled. The physical infrastructure of the level was still recognizably derived from the same original construction as the levels above: iron floor plates, structural columns at regular intervals, a ceiling at approximately 4 meters of height. But the space between the original infrastructure had been entirely filled with secondary construction that bore no relationship to the original architectural plan. Structures built from salvaged material, compressed rubble, melted metal, scavenged pipe, and what I can only describe as composed organic matter, material that had once been many different things and had been compacted and shaped and allowed to harden into surfaces that were load-bearing and apparently stable. The result was a built environment that occupied the full volume of the level in 3 dimensions, with passageways that were not corridors but gaps, with habitation spaces that were not rooms but cavities. I could not walk upright in most of it. The population of level 2400 was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. People moved through the spaces around me with the efficiency of long practice in extremely constrained physical environments, and they assessed me with the quick, complete assessment of people for whom reading strangers accurately was a survival function rather than a social one. I was not attacked. I want to be clear about that. I was observed, tracked, and given passage. But the nature of the observation and the nature of the passage made clear that these were not acts of indifference but of decision. I was permitted. I spent 3 days on level 2400, working my way through as much of the level's physical geography as I could access. My census engine's ambient count suggested a population between 60 and 80,000, though the density of secondary construction made confident Auspex readings difficult. The people I was able to speak with, through a combination of Low Gothic and what appeared to be a local dialect that retained High Gothic syntactical structures applied to entirely non-standard vocabulary, told me things that I documented carefully, without fully processing until later. The gang structure on level 2400 was not a structure in the administrative sense, it was a theological one. The primary territorial organization was not defined by material resources, control of transit routes, or proximity to manufacturing output in the way that gang structures in the tolerance zones were defined. It was defined by proximity to the downward hatches. The groups that controlled access to the lower levels were not wealthy in material terms compared to the gangs I had encountered on level 2800. They were, however, the objects of something that had the weight and texture of religious awe from the communities around them. I asked an elderly man who sat near one of the downward hatches what was below. He did not answer immediately. He looked at the hatch, which was made of steel that was noticeably different from the surrounding materials, smoother, older, bearing marks along its edges that I could not identify as either standard Mechanicus notation or gang symbolism. Then he said, "There is what was built, and there is what was found. Above you is what was built. Below is the beginning of what was found." He paused and looked back at me. He said, "Which is why no one comes up to count it." That sentence entered my mind and stayed there. I descended to level 2200. The air quality on level 2200 was categorically different from anything above. My rebreather was doing meaningful work, filtering particulates and managing atmospheric composition in a way that made the resistance against my breathing perceptible. The temperature had dropped. which was unexpected in a deep hive environment where thermal accumulation from below and habitation density typically produced heat. The cold came from the walls, not from ventilation, not from any active cooling system, but from the walls themselves, which were at this level no longer primarily composed of the standard iron alloy construction materials of the original hive fabric, but increasingly mixed with stone. Not processed stone, not formed structural aggregate, but bedrock, the native geological material of the Varanthos prime surface that Hive Golgothar had been sunk into over its centuries of construction. The hive descended into the planetary crust. I had known this as an abstract engineering fact. I was now inside the fact. The structures on level 2200 were not secondary construction in the salvaged sense of level 2400. They were cut. Someone had cut into the bedrock walls of this level and shaped the cuts with deliberate geometry. The cuts were old, older than the iron floor plates they abutted, older than the hive construction that had been lowered around them. I ran my hand along one surface and felt the precision of the work. Edges that had not worn smooth with time, but had been finished smooth in their original creation. Stone surfaces that were flat and regular in a way that required either tools of considerable sophistication or a duration of effort that implied a civilization with reason to invest that effort. My data slate had a passive archaeomaterial analysis function, a secondary tool that I had never used in 9 years of census work, because census work does not ordinarily require material dating. I activated it and held it against the cut stone. The result it returned was not a precise date. Passive analysis on a census data slate was not archaeology, but it gave me a range, a thermal decay profile, and surface crystallization index that corresponded to a period of active working approximately 9,000 to 13,000 years prior to the present date. I stood in the cold dark and looked at that number for a long time. The founding records of Hive Golgothar, which I had reviewed before my descent as part of standard pre-mission documentation review, placed the construction of the hive's lowest founding stratum at approximately 6,000 years ago. Standard imperial settlement chronology placed the initial colonization of Varanthos Prime at approximately 7,000 years ago. The cuts in the stone were older than both of those dates by a margin that could not be explained by any standard imperial archaeological framework. I documented this. I did not yet know what I was documenting. Level 2000 took me a full week to traverse because the level was, in physical terms, not a level in the sense I had been using above. It was a zone. A vertical zone that occupied approximately 30 meters of height rather than the 4 to 6 meters of the standard hive floor plate, and which was not a floor plate at all, but a natural cave system that the original hive construction crews had apparently reached during their downward founding operations and had incorporated into the hive structure by the straightforward expedient of sealing its upper and lower natural openings with the same iron plate construction used throughout the hive, leaving the cave system's interior as a single anomalously large habitation space without the column grid and ceiling uniformity of the manufactured levels. The cave was inhabited. Population estimate from my census engine, indeterminate. The space was too large and too structurally irregular for the bio-auspex to function accurately. I estimated, from direct observation supplemented by the auspex's highest confidence readings in the most accessible areas, a population between 10 and 20,000 individuals. The accuracy of that range was, I acknowledged in my documentation, not high. What I could document with more confidence was the nature of the habitation. The cave walls were covered in text, not graffiti, not gang marks, not the territorial symbols I had documented on upper levels. Text. Dense, continuous text in a script that I recognized after careful examination as an archaic form of High Gothic, not the ornate ceremonial variant used in ministorum documents, but an older register, closer to the functional administrative forms preserved in very early imperial bureaucratic records. The text covered every surface of the cave walls from floor to ceiling and extended into side passages and vertical chimneys in the cave system that I could see but not reach. I photographed as much as I could with my data slate's optical sensor. I was able to read fragments. My formal education had included classical High Gothic because census training at the higher grades required facility with early imperial documentation formats. Most of what I could read was damaged, worn by moisture and time, but enough survived to give me content. The fragments I could reconstruct were records, inventories, counts of material goods, quantities of stored resources, population figures organized by function rather than location. The script was consistent enough and the document structure regular enough that I could identify it with reasonable confidence as administrative documentation, the kind of record that a functioning administrative apparatus generated as a matter of course. But the items being inventoried were not items I recognized from any imperial production catalog. Some entries I could not translate because they used vocabulary I did not know. Others I could translate in their individual words, but not in their assembled meaning. The phrase I was able to read most clearly, because it was larger than the surrounding text and repeated at intervals across the cave wall, translated, with the caveat that my classical High Gothic was functional rather than scholarly, as approximately, maintained below the register of the living, for the continuation of the old accounting. The old accounting. I looked at those words on my data slate screen for a long time. Around me, the cave's population moved with the quiet assurance of people entirely accustomed to their environment, and they paid me the same calibrated attention they had been paying me since level 2400, that specific quality of alert permission that was simultaneously watchful and disengaged. I was not a threat. I was not a welcome guest. I was a phenomenon being observed to determine whether I would constitute a problem. I descended to level 1800. The numbering I am using reflects the official Administratum Registry, which counted levels downward from level 8417 at the Spire Peak to level 1 at the founding base stratum. Level 1800, therefore, was approximately 2000 levels below the ground level entry point of the Hive, deep within the planetary crust of Varanthos Prime. Conventional Hive engineering placed the lowest habitable founding stratum at around level 200, below which, according to the registry, were only infrastructure levels containing the geothermal taps, deep core foundation pilings, and the mechanical systems that managed the Hive's interaction with the planetary geology. Below level 1800, I had only the theoretical registry. The actual physical reality of what was there had never, as far as the official documentation showed, been directly enumerated by any census official. Level 1800 was the first level that told me the official registry was wrong in ways more significant than population undercounting. The official registry listed level 1800 as a mechanical infrastructure zone, which meant it should have contained primarily automated systems, servitor maintenance tracks, and Mechanicus standard duct infrastructure, with no habitation and no human population. What I found was habitation on a scale that the structural conditions of the level made even more disorienting than the population surplus I had documented on level 3000. Thousands of people lived on level 1800 in a permanent and multi-generational community that had, from the evidence of its construction and social organization, been established there for long enough that the people living there had no personal memory of having arrived and no knowledge, except as received tradition, of anything above. I spoke with them, or rather, I was brought to speak with those of them who chose to speak with me, which was not a universal inclination. The speaker was a man of indeterminate age, somewhere between 40 and 70, with skin that had the particular pallor of someone who had spent their entire life at depths where no natural or artificial full-spectrum light penetrated. He wore robes that combined salvaged industrial fabric with something organic. I could not determine the biological origin of the fibers with certainty, and the robes were marked with the now familiar symbols I had been documenting since level 2200, the carved symbols from the stone walls, reproduced in thread and paint and scar tissue. He told me his title, in the archaic High Gothic of the cave walls. It translated, as best I could manage, as the registrar of what remains. I told him I was also a registrar. He looked at me and said, "I know. The books told us you were coming." I asked what books. He gestured at the walls, and I understood that he meant the text that covered every surface of this level, as it had covered the cave walls on level 2000. I asked when the books had said I would come. He said, they did not specify. They said that a counter of the upper world would descend when the level above was breached, and would come to us still believing that counting was a task that could be completed. I asked whether it could not be. He said, "Counting can be completed, but not by the counter you sent. Those are different problems." I documented the exchange and continued. The structure of the community on level 1800 was unlike anything I had encountered above. It had governance, clear and functional governance, but not hierarchical governance in the administratum or gang territorial sense. It was organizational governance based on function rather than authority. People were organized by what they maintained. Maintenance of the stone-carved text was the highest status function. Maintenance of the biological systems, of which there were many on this level, tended in a manner that combined Mechanicus principles with something distinctly older, was the next. The social arrangements, the resource distribution, the conflict resolution mechanisms, all derived from and referred back to the functions of maintenance rather than to any external authority, imperial or otherwise. They did not know of the emperor in the specific religious sense of the ministorum. They knew of a prior authority, ancient and patient, that had organized the lower levels of this world's rock before the hive was built, and they maintained that authority's records as their primary social purpose. I noted that none of them questioned my presence in terms of authority. They questioned my purpose in terms of adequacy. Level 1600 was where the stone took over entirely. The iron floor plates that had characterized every manufactured level of the hive above were present here only in fragments, pieces of old construction bolted to stone surfaces as afterthoughts, as if the builders of the hive had descended this far and attempted to impose their familiar material vocabulary on a substrate that declined to be organized by it. The bedrock of Varanthos Prime at this depth was a dark basalt composite, heavy and close-grained, and it was not empty. It had been worked extensively, methodically, over a very long time, by hands and tools I could not identify but whose output I could see. Tunnels cut with geometric precision, chambers of regular dimension, surfaces dressed to tolerances that my census data slate's measurement functions indicated were accurate to fractions of a millimeter. These were not caves, these were rooms. The rooms were interconnected by a corridor system that, once I had walked enough of it to perceive its organizing logic, revealed itself as something I recognized in its deep grammar, even when I could not read its surface vocabulary. It was a building. An enormous subterranean building of vast extent, built into and through the native rock of the planet, predating the hive above it by millennia, and still partially functional in ways that the hive's construction had not disrupted, because the hive's construction had been, from the evidence of the joining points where hive foundation pillars met the older stonework, carefully aligned to avoid the pre-existing subterranean structure. The hive had been built around this building. Not into it, not through it, around it. The foundation pilings of Hive Golgotha, those enormous driven columns of manufactured ferrocrete and iron that every hive city required to anchor its vast structure to the planet's geology, had been placed with what I now understood as deliberate care to avoid the rooms and corridors of the structure beneath. Someone who designed the hive's foundations 6,000 years ago had known this structure was here and had chosen to preserve it. I sat down in one of the stone corridors and looked at that understanding for a long time. The implication was institutional. It was not the implication of a construction crew that had accidentally discovered ancient ruins and pragmatically worked around them. It was the implication of a decision made at an organizational level by people with authority over the hive's founding design to construct the hive in specific relationship to what was beneath it. A relationship of enclosure, a relationship of protection, a relationship that had, over 6,000 years, been buried under layers of administrative categories and registry designations and census projections until the decision itself had become invisible, but its consequences were everywhere around me in stone. I continued deeper. Level 1400 was where my portable census engine stopped functioning. Not from physical damage. I checked it carefully, because it was my primary professional instrument, and I treated it accordingly. The device powered normally. Its display functions were operational, but the bio-auspex function, the ambient life sign detection system that I had relied upon since level 3500 for population density estimates in areas where direct enumeration was impractical, returned nothing, not zero readings, not a failure code. It returned an active readout of normal function with no data. The auspex signal was broadcasting normally and receiving nothing that it recognized as life signs. The corridors around me were not empty. People moved in them, or rather, beings moved in them, and the distinction I have placed between those two words is one I did not make lightly and did not make immediately. The beings that moved in the stone corridors of level 1400 were humanoid in basic morphology, bipedal, bilaterally symmetric, within the range of standard human dimensional parameters. But they moved differently, not in the way that people deformed by mutation or malnutrition move, with the compensatory adjustments that bodies make to structural deviations from optimal function. They moved differently in the way that people who have been shaped by different requirements from birth move, with an economy and a precision that spoke of an environment whose demands had, over generations, selected for particular capabilities. The bio-auspex did not register them as life. I do not know what that means. I documented it. I wrote down exactly what my census engine returned, and exactly what my eyes reported, and placed those two data points side by side, without resolving the conflict between them, because resolving it would have required me to either trust my instrument over my senses, or trust my senses over my instrument, and neither of those resolutions felt adequate to what I was observing. They did not harm me. They moved around me with the same quality of calibrated permission I had been experiencing since level 2400, amplified to the point where it felt less like social assessment and more like environmental navigation, the way water navigates around a stone in a stream, not through choice or judgment, but through the path that geometry provides. One of them stopped near me and looked at me directly. Its face was human in general structure and in specific feature. Eyes, nose, mouth, arranged in the proportions of a human face. But the skin had a quality I could not describe in terms of color. It was not pale like the level 1800 community's pallor from light deprivation. It was something other than color, a quality of the surface that my eyes processed, and my mind failed to categorize using available references. It looked at me for approximately 30 seconds and then it moved on. My data slate registered nothing during those 30 seconds. I went further down. By level 1200, I had passed through 3 more of the large stone chambers, and I had begun to understand their function. The carved text that I had first encountered on level 2200, and which had been present in increasing density with every level I descended, was here at a concentration that covered every available surface completely, without gaps, and extended into horizontal surfaces, the floor and ceiling as well as the walls, so that moving through the chambers meant moving through text in every direction. I could not read most of it. The script evolved with depth. The classical high Gothic of the upper chambers gave way, level by level, to an older register that retained the same fundamental letter forms, but applied them according to grammatical and syntactical principles that departed increasingly from the high Gothic I knew. By level 1200, I could parse individual words but not sentences, because the structure that connected words into meaning had become unfamiliar enough that the meaning did not resolve. It was still writing. It was still, in some fundamental sense, a record. The document nature of it was legible even when the content was not. The format of administrative record-keeping, the columns, the repeated structural formulas, the tabular arrangements of enumerated items, all of that survived the drift of the language. I was looking at something that had maintained the formal properties of bureaucratic documentation across a span of time and cultural distance that had dissolved its legibility, and the persistence of those formal properties across that span felt, to me, like the most important thing I had encountered since the material dating result on level 2200. Someone, something, had been keeping records in this place for 11,000 years. The thought arrived in my mind not as a conclusion from the evidence, but as a recognition, the way you recognize a face you have always known, but have never consciously examined. I had been a keeper of records for 9 years. I had spent 9 years believing that records were an instrument of control, the administratum's tool for managing populations too large to know individually. What is counted is known. What is known can be controlled. Standing in a chamber of 11,000-year-old records in the sub-foundation of a hive city that had been built around them by people who chose to preserve rather than destroy, I understood that I had the relationship inverted. The records were not the instrument of control. The records were the control. Not the mechanism of control, but the thing itself, the act of maintenance, the work of continuing. I sat down on the stone floor and held that understanding for a long time. The cold of the stone was precise and total and not unpleasant. I ate the last of my ration bricks. I drank the last of my water from the canteen. I had been underground for far longer than the 47-day estimate that my mission brief had specified, and I had the particular clarity of thought that comes when physical condition has simplified itself to the essential and the non-essential has been removed. I had more to document, I went on. Level 1000 was the first level where I found evidence of the Hive's official infrastructure existing in direct relationship with the old structure in a way that was not incidental. On level 1200 and above, the Hive's geothermal infrastructure ran adjacent to the stone construction, parallel to it, occasionally using the older tunnels as conduit routes, but in the way that you use a road that someone else built, without understanding or acknowledging why the road was there. On level 1000, the relationship was different. The Hive's geothermal tap networks, the deep pipes that drew thermal energy from the planet's interior and distributed it upward through the Hive's power systems, connected to the old structure, not at its exterior walls but at specific internal points, junctions that appeared in the old stonework as deliberate installations, designed apertures with seal surfaces and connection geometries that exactly matched the Hive's geothermal tap specifications. The geothermal taps had not been connected to the old structure. They had been connected to the old structure's own tap points, designed millennia before the Hive existed to receive exactly the kind of connection the Hive eventually provided. I stood at one of these junction points for a long time, holding my data slate against the stone, running every passive analysis function it possessed. I was not an engineer. I was not an archaeologist. My census data slate was not the right instrument for what I was trying to understand. But even with the wrong instrument, the broad shape of what I was looking at was unmistakable. The old structure was not dormant. It was not a ruin. It was not a historical artifact that the Hive had preserved by accident or by architectural caprice. It was a system in the same operational sense that the Hive above was a system, and the Hive above had been, since its construction 6,000 years ago, providing power to it. I thought about the vacant district on level 6,800. I thought about the 17% population deficit in the noble tier. I thought about the population flowing down through the levels like water through a crack. I thought about the registrar of what remains and his wall text, and his certainty that I was coming before I had arrived. I thought about the thing that had breached the floor of level 3847 from below, and I descended to level 800. Level 800 was, in the official registry, the lowest level that the administratum acknowledged as existing. The registry's enumeration of Hive Golgothar's 8,417 levels reached its terminus at level 1, the founding base stratum, and below level 800, the registry listed only the infrastructure designations I have already described: geothermal taps, foundation pilings, mechanicus maintenance shafts. The sub-level 800 designations used different numeric formatting, a sub-prefix notation that indicated they were not officially levels in the census sense but infrastructure compartments, not counted in the 8,417 total. Below level 800 were, in this alternate accounting, another 216 sub-levels that no census had ever enumerated. 8,417 plus 216. 8,633 total levels, if you counted what the registry chose not to count. I was a census administrator. My professional identity was built on the principle that what was real should be counted, and what was counted was real. The registry's choice not to count the sub-levels, enforced over the entire history of the Hive's documentation, was not a counting error. It was a policy. A sustained, institutional, deliberate policy of not counting what was below the line that someone, at the Hive's founding, had decided was the bottom. The bottom was not the bottom. Level 800 was the last level that I can describe using the spatial vocabulary of the Hive above. It was large and stone-floored and lit by a bioluminescent organism that covered the ceiling in a continuous living sheet, producing a cold, steady blue-green light that had none of the warmth of manufactured lumen globes and all of their functional adequacy. The temperature here was lower than anywhere above. The air had a mineral quality that was not unpleasant, cool and dry and faintly charged, like the air in a mountain cave during a lightning storm. The beings that populated this level, and I use beings rather than people, not from any failure of respect, but from a simple acknowledgement that I did not have adequate census data to determine whether the standard human census classification applied to them in all respects, moved through the chambers with purpose that was clearly directed at the maintenance of the text on the walls, which here was of a density and complexity that went beyond covering every surface and into a three-dimensional layering, new text inscribed over old text over older text, such that the walls had gained millimeters of depth from nothing but the accumulated inscription of records over thousands of years. They brought me to a room. The room was at the center of the level. It was circular, approximately 20 meters in diameter, with a ceiling that rose to a natural dome in the stone perhaps 15 meters above the floor. The walls of the room were covered in the same layered text as the rest of the level, but at the room's center there was a single piece of furniture, a desk. Stone, carved from the same basalt as the room itself, smooth-surfaced, roughly the dimensions of my own desk on level 4180. On the desk sat a data slate, not a portable census data slate like mine, a different device, larger, with a casing that combined metal and stone in a way I could not identify as either Mechanicus manufacture or pre-imperial craft with any confidence. Its display surface was active, showing text in the same archaic register as the surrounding walls. Its power source, whatever it was clearly functional. They left me alone in the room with it. I sat down at the desk. I looked at the device for a long time. I looked at the text it was displaying. I could not read most of it, but at the bottom of the visible text, in a register that shifted back toward the more legible classical High Gothic of the middle levels, were 3 lines that I could translate with reasonable confidence. The first line read, "The census continues." The second line read, "The census has always continued." The third line read, "You will add what you have counted, and what you have counted will be kept." I looked at my own data slate, which contained 9 years of census work and, now, the documentation of my descent through 8,417 officially registered levels and 216 unregistered sub-levels. I looked at the desk. I looked at the text on the walls. I looked at the device. The silence was absolute. I am telling this story in the first person, and I have been careful to note that I am a person of records, a person who documents rather than interprets. But here I must tell you something that is neither documentation nor interpretation, but simply what happened, stated plainly in the full awareness that it will be received as impossible by any authority within the administratum hierarchy that might review this account. I understood what the room was. It was not a room. It was a function. The room was the continuation of something that had been operating in this space for 11,000 years, and it was the physical manifestation of the same impulse that had driven me to become a census administrator, the same impulse that had built the administratum, the same impulse that had incised the first records on these cave walls before the Imperium of Man existed, before Varanthos Prime was colonized, before any human authority had come to this world to count its people. Someone had been here before all of that. Someone had been here, and they had understood that counting was not an instrument of control. Counting was a form of care. The act of enumeration was the act of acknowledgement. You existed, you were here, you were included in the account. And whoever had built this room had built it as an instruction, left in stone for 11,000 years, waiting for the kind of person who would eventually be sent downward by the kind of institution that had grown, necessarily and inevitably, from the same root impulse that had first motivated the people who built this place. I placed my data slate on the desk beside the old device. The old device's display shifted. New text appeared in a register that I could read, not quite high Gothic but close enough. A carefully chosen register, I thought, for a carefully anticipated audience. It said, "The account is received. The account will be maintained. The census continues." The words on the surrounding walls began to change, not dramatically, not with any sound or visible mechanism. They changed the way text on a display surface changes when new information is added, scrolling slightly, making room, incorporating. The walls were adding my census data to 11,000 years of accumulated enumeration. Every person I had counted in 9 years of census work. Every discrepancy I had documented. Every person who had flowed downward through the levels and disappeared from the official count. Every population that had accumulated below the official line. Every being on level 1400 that the bio-auspex had failed to register. Every member of the community on level 1800 who maintained the old records as their highest status function. All of them were in the account now. I stayed in the room for a long time. The bioluminescent light from outside, visible through the open doorway, held steady. The beings moved through the corridors. The text accumulated on the walls. Then I began the ascent. I want to be clear that the ascent was not a transformation story. I did not emerge from the depths changed in the dramatic sense that stories about people going into the darkness and returning transformed tend to require. I was still Aldrin Voss, still a census administrator, still a man whose primary cognitive habit was the identification and recording of measurable phenomena. What had changed was not my nature, but my understanding of what I had always been doing, an understanding that arrived not as a revelation from outside, but as a recognition of something that had been present in the work all along, and that required, simply, the right circumstances to become visible to me. The ascent took longer than the descent. I had descended in a state of professional momentum, moving forward because the mission required it. The ascent was a different kind of movement, the movement of someone carrying a weight that was not physical, but was genuinely heavy, the weight of understanding that the institution I served had been, for 6,000 years, maintaining an official not knowing of something that the physical structure of the city it administered contained as a permanent fact. The not knowing was not accidental. It was, as the aligned foundation pilings demonstrated, a choice made at the founding and maintained through every subsequent administrative cycle by the simple expedient of never assigning a census mandate that reached far enough to encounter the truth. I had been assigned a census mandate that reached far enough. I thought about this as I climbed. I thought about why someone had finally issued that order. The collapse on level 3847. The floor breached from below. Something had come up, and whatever had come up had forced the administratum's hand. The severed data conduit network required restoration, which required physical inspection of the lower levels, which required assigning a census official to go down. The breach had created a necessity that the institutional will to not know could not override without appearing negligent in its tithe accounting. I thought about the registrar of what remains, and his certainty that I was coming. I thought about the books that had told him. I thought about what it meant that the old accounting had known, 11,000 years in advance, that eventually the hive above would send someone down, and had arranged itself to receive exactly that person, and had been patient in its waiting, with the patience of a thing that had survived long enough that 47 days and 11,000 years were not qualitatively different durations. By level 2400, I had been traveling continuously for what felt like 8 or 9 days without adequate sleep or food, and my body was registering this in the specific way that bodies register insufficient maintenance, a persistent low-grade deterioration of precision, a slight tremor in the hands, a tendency for thoughts to take longer to arrive at their conclusions. I ate what food the community on level 2400 offered me, which was unfamiliar in texture but adequate in sustaining quality, and slept for what they indicated was a full rest cycle in a cavity that had been prepared for the purpose. In the morning, such as morning existed in a space without day, I climbed on. Level 3847, the site of the collapse, I found differently on my return. The arbitrator perimeter was still in place, but Proctor Thresh was no longer there. A younger officer, a sub-proctor whose name I did not get, was in command of the detail, and he told me that Thresh had been recalled upward to give testimony to an administratum investigation into the collapse event. The investigation had been initiated approximately 3 weeks after my departure from the perimeter. I asked what the investigation had concluded. He said that the collapse was a structural realignment event, and that the census mission dispatched to document the lower levels had failed to make its scheduled check-in transmissions. I was listed, he told me, in the flat voice of someone reading from an official log, as census assets unaccounted for. I showed him my data slate. He looked at the transmission log, which showed continuous documentation through the descent and ascent, and at the blank entries where my scheduled check-in transmissions should have been. The check-in transmission system had, I explained, been rendered non-functional below level 3200 by the same data conduit disruption that had motivated the census mission. He looked at me, and then at my data slate, and then at me again. He asked whether I had a complete census report. I said I did. He authorized my passage through the perimeter with the focused efficiency of a man who understood that the correct management of this situation was to return it to the administrative level as quickly as possible and allow the apparatus above to determine what to do with it. I continued upward. The return through the mid-hive was different from the descent because I was now a person carrying completed documentation rather than a person conducting an ongoing mission, and the difference in internal state produced a different quality of attention. I looked at the Manufactorum Equatorial Belt differently. I looked at the transit hub on level 3900 differently. I looked at the faces of the workers and the patrols and the servitors and the priests at their portable shrines, and I looked at them knowing that every one of them was in the account, the old account as well as the administratum's account, and that the account's continuation depended on people like the community on level 1800 who had made it their purpose to maintain the record. What is counted is known. I reached level 4180, my own office level, on a day that my data slate told me was the 63rd day since my departure, 16 days beyond the estimated mission duration. I stood outside my office door, which was locked, and found my key in my robe pocket where it had always been. The office smelled the same, recycled air and tallow fat lubricant. The lumen globe came on when I activated it. The pneumatic document tubes ran along the ceiling. My desk was as I had left it, except for a layer of fine particulate dust that accumulated in the mid-hive within days of any surface being left unattended. I sat down at my desk. I connected my data slate to the census engine charging array and began the process of compiling my full census report. It was the most extensive census report in my personal professional history. It contained documentation for all 3,846 levels below level 3,847 that had been specified in my mission brief, enumerated by the standards and protocols the administratum required. It also contained documentation for the 216 sub-levels below level 800 that the mission brief had not specified because the mission brief had not known they existed. and it contained something that no census report in the history of Hive Golgotha had ever contained. It contained a full physical and population description of the structure beneath the founding stratum, the pre-imperial construction, the chambers and corridors cut from basalt, the text on the walls, the beings on level 1400 that the bio-auspex could not register as life, the community on level 1800 and their maintained records, the registrar of what remains, the junction points where the Hive's geothermal taps had been connected to the old structure's own tap apertures, the desk, the device, the 3 lines. I wrote all of it down with the same precision and care that I had applied to every census report of my career. I added a section at the end of the report, which was not standard census protocol, but which I considered professionally necessary, a summary observation of the kind I had never had occasion to write before because census reports documented what was there and did not comment on what it meant, that stated plainly that the structure beneath level 800 predated the Hive by a minimum of 3,000 years and had been deliberately preserved by the Hive's founding construction through alignment of foundation pilings to avoid the older structure's integrity, and that the Hive's geothermal infrastructure had been functioning in operational connection with the older structure since the Hive's founding, and that the older structure housed a population that was not registered in any official census document and which had maintained continuous habitation since a period that passive material analysis suggested extended to at least 11,000 years before present. I calculated the total population of Hive Golgotha as documented in my report. 8,417 official levels, plus 216 sub-levels, plus the unregistered population of the old structure, which I estimated, with the considerable uncertainty that my limited instrumentation required me to acknowledge, at between 50 and 200,000 individuals. The grand total was the largest census population figure I had ever produced. It was also the most incomplete population figure I had ever produced, and I stated both of those things in the report's summary section. I submitted the report. This requires a brief technical description that is nevertheless important. In the administratum system of Hive Golgotha, census reports at the executor-scribe level were submitted via the pneumatic document tube network to the primary data repository on level 4800, where a bank of census processing servitors performed initial intake, sorting, cataloging, and distribution to relevant sub-bureaus. The servitors were administratum standard units, with cognitive augmentations specialized for document processing, high-speed reading, categorical sorting, cross-reference generation, archival filing. They were extremely efficient at these functions and entirely incapable of functions outside them. They could process the content of a census report at speeds no unaugmented human could match. They could not evaluate the implications of what they processed. My report was received by the intake servitor on duty at the level 4800 repository at the 3rd bell on the day of my return. The servitor processed it in approximately 14 minutes. It sorted the census data components to the standard population registry, the structural assessment components to the infrastructure survey archive, the anomalous findings documentation to the unresolved classification pending review file, and the summary observation section to the administrative commentary archive. It stamped the whole with a received and filed notation, and then it moved on to the next document in the intake queue, which was a routine population transfer form from a level 5200 dormitory block, and processed it with exactly the same efficient, incurious, thoroughgoing competence. I sat at my desk and thought about the servitor for a long time. I thought about it because it was, in a specific and important sense, the point. The servitor was the mechanism by which the institution maintained its not knowing, not through malice, not through conspiracy, not through any organized suppression. Through simple, structural, cognitive limitation applied consistently across the entire apparatus. Information entered the system, was processed by instruments adequate to the processing, and emerged categorized and filed and preserved, without anyone possessing both the access to the full record and the cognitive framework to understand what the full record contained. The truth of what lay beneath Hive Golgotha was, as of the moment of my filing, preserved perfectly, completely, in proper bureaucratic form, stamped and archived and cross-referenced. It was not hidden, it was not suppressed, it was filed. And it would remain filed, I understood, for exactly as long as no human consciousness, with the right combination of context, knowledge, and orientation, happened to access the relevant files and connect the relevant categories, which was, in an institution as vast and as specialized as the administratum, likely to be a very long time. I thought about the old accounting and its 11,000 years of patience. I thought about the registrar of what remains, and whether patience was the right word for what an 11,000-year institution exercised, or whether patience was simply what humans called the ordinary operational duration of something that had no reason to hurry because it had already outlasted every form of hurrying that the world above it had attempted. I opened the top drawer of my desk and removed a blank census form, standard administratum template, printed on pressed fiber board, pre-stamped with the Bureau of Census and Enumeration header. I had 10,000 of them in a cabinet to my left, because census work consumed forms at the rate of ambient air conditioning consumed recycled air, continuously and without particular appreciation. I placed the blank form on the desk in front of me. I thought about what I would write. The complete census of Hive Golgotha was filed. Its truth was preserved. My professional obligation, in the strictest and most formal sense, was discharged. I was an executor scribe, mid-grade census administrator, rated competent in field documentation. I had completed my mission. But I was also a person who had sat in a room carved from basalt 11,000 years before the imperium of man had come to this world, and had understood that the act of keeping the record was itself the thing that mattered, regardless of whether the record was read, regardless of whether its contents were acted upon, regardless of whether the institution receiving it had any capacity to understand what it meant. The record existed, the account continued. That was the purpose. That was the entire purpose. I picked up my auto stylus. I began to write. Not a census report, not a standard administratum form. A personal account, in plain low Gothic without formulaic language, of what I had experienced and what I had understood during the 63 days of my descent and return. I wrote without haste. I wrote without knowing what would happen to what I wrote, or whether anyone would ever read it. I wrote with the careful attention to accuracy that 9 years of professional practice had built into the habits of my hands and mind, because accuracy was not a professional standard to me now. It was a form of respect. I wrote until the lumen globe above my desk cycled through its maintenance dim at the 20-second bell, and I continued writing in the dim, and I wrote until the bell for the morning cycle, and I continued. The report I filed went into the archive, stamped and complete, tended by the servitors who could not understand it. The account I wrote by hand, in a single continuous document on the back sides of standard census forms, telling the full story of everything I had seen and understood, was placed in a sealed document capsule from the bottom drawer of my desk, the one I had never used because census administrators at the executor scribe grade did not ordinarily receive correspondence requiring the privacy of a sealed capsule. I addressed the capsule. I addressed it not to a supervisor, not to a bureau chief, not to the governor's administrative staff or the Arbeits or the Mechanicus or the Ministorum, or any authority of the Imperium that might have institutional reason to receive it. I addressed it to the intake queue of the level 4800 data repository. To the servitors who would receive it and process it and file it with perfect fidelity and without understanding, alongside my census report, in the vast institutional archive where everything the administratum knew about Hive Golgotha was preserved and cross-referenced and tended with the same patient, incurious thoroughness as the beings on level 1400 who moved through their ancient corridors continuing the old accounting. The truth, I had come to understand, did not need to be understood to be preserved. It needed to be entered into the record. It needed to be in the account. I dropped the capsule into the pneumatic tube. I heard it accelerate upward toward level 4800 with the familiar pop and hiss of the tube system functioning as designed. I sat at my desk in the Lumen Globe's ordinary orange glow. The office smelled of recycled air and tallow fat lubricant. The ventilation ran with its usual hum. In the archive on level 4800, the servitor on the incoming queue received a sealed document capsule with an internal routing address, opened it, processed the contents, assigned the resulting document to the appropriate archival subcategory, and stamped it with a received and filed notation. In the sub-foundation of Hive Golgotha, in rooms cut from basalt before the Imperium existed, in chambers lit by bioluminescent life that had never needed a manufactured light source, the walls continued to accumulate text. The beings who maintained the record moved through the corridors. The registrar of what remains sat at whatever desk he occupied and kept the account. The census continued. The census had always continued. On level 4180, Executor Scribe Aldrin Voss put down his auto stylus and looked at his desk for a long time. Then he opened his bottom drawer and removed a fresh stack of blank census forms. He had a full workload queued from the weeks of his absence. 47 days of routine census work waiting in the pneumatic tube output tray, forms requiring enumeration, population transfers requiring registration, mortality records requiring incorporation into the projections for the next tithe cycle. He began to work. He worked with the same precision he had always brought to the work, the same care, the same attention. Every form he processed was a person acknowledged. Every number he entered was a continuation of the account. He had not known this 9 years ago, but the work had been the same work then. The understanding changed what it felt like, not what it was. He filed 16 completed reports before the midday bell and began on the 17th. Somewhere beneath him, 11,000 years deep, the walls received his addition to the account and held it in basalt. The count went on.